Started. So this is making a noise. Just want to say this is an AI generated image. It's not a real image. Get it at crayon.com. That's all my citations. Okay, so thank you all for joining me today for my PhD thesis defense. My title is Disentangling Capacity Loss Mechanisms in Lithium-ion Liquid and Solid Electrolyte Batteries. I want to begin the talk by addressing the cost of electric vehicles. If we look at this plot, the y-axis is household income across the US, and the x-axis is the share of electric vehicle owners. What you can see is the vast majority of electric vehicle owners exist in that top tier bracket in terms of income. This represents less than a third of all US households in terms of income. So what that says to me is the electric vehicle is not necessarily affordable to the average consumer yet. A major driver for that is the cost of the battery, hence my talk is on batteries. And when we look at the electric vehicle price, we have to think about different metrics of the battery, including the lifetime of the battery, how long it lasts, the range of the battery, how far you can travel based on its capacity, and then additionally the charging rate, how quickly you can discharge your battery. To understand all of these metrics, we have to go one step deeper and understand very clearly the relationship between these metrics and a metric called capacity. I'm going to walk you through an understanding of capacity with a small cartoon. This is a cartoon of a battery. On the left-hand side is the positive electrode. It is also the low energy electrode. It is where in a lithium-ion battery, your lithium starts out when you are discharged. On the right, you have the high energy electrode or the negative electrode. When you charge, your neutral lithium atom splits into lithium electron and lithium ion. The electron travels through the external circuit and the lithium ion goes into the electrolyte. The electrolyte can be either a liquid in the more traditional case or a solid in some of our more next generation battery technologies. Eventually, the two at the end of charging meet together at the high energy electrode where you're storing some of that energy as potential energy. Now, this is not exactly what our electrodes look like. They're not these lovely blocks. Instead, we have different particles. Those particles, for example, I'm going to zoom into the positive electrode here. The positive electrode is going to be the focus of the rest of my talk. We have a series of particles that are going to be connected to the current collector, which does exactly that, collects your electrons, connected by some sort of electronic conductor. We use carbon black. And the whole thing is infiltrated with the electrolyte. In this case, I'm showing the liquid electrolyte, which makes perfect contact with all of your positive electrode particles to facilitate lithium-ion transfer. Now, within these particles, our capacity is determined in part by the amount of lithium that is stored within those particles at discharge. There are a number of ways that we can lose capacity as we start to cycle. So one of the first ways is you can lose lithium inventory. For example, lithium can be lost to side reactions that are not reversible within the cycling parameters that we have, and you don't get that lithium back. Additionally, you might lose some active material, which loses your ability to store the lithium and therefore cycle it back and forth, losing the ability to pass charge. So your actual capacity, although it's a function of your theoretical capacity, the amount of material in your system, it's also going to be a function of how much you're losing throughout the cycle. So not only is capacity a function of the amount of charge passed, but it's also a function of voltage. And voltage in itself is a function, in the case of the positive electrode, of the lithium content in the electrode material. What I'm showing here is a cartoon of a voltage versus capacity profile. This is the equilibrium voltage profile, meaning we're not charging, we don't have any current applied in our system. And at rest, the voltage is a function of the concentration of lithium in your electrode. Again, I'm just focusing on the positive electrode for this talk. And so in the positive electrode, I will note now the capacity is related to 1 minus the concentration. As you charge your battery, you are delithiating your positive electrode, the concentration goes down, capacity goes up, vice versa occurs on discharge. So I'm going to start that now because that's confusing for people, at least in the battery field as well. So if we lose some of our capacity, what happens to the equilibrium voltage curve? We're going to have a slight shrinking of that voltage curve if we're going to lose some of that actual capacity. But how does voltage come into play here? Within our battery system, as we are charging, you'll notice that the voltage curve tends to be bumped up a bit and on discharge bumped down a bit. And this is a result of resistance, which shifts the equilibrium curve. You can think of it as Ohm's law, so V equals IR. If you have positive current times the resistance, it's going to increase the voltage, negative current, decrease the voltage. And when we're cycling, we like to set voltage limits. This is a way we protect the materials in the system from degradation. As a result, what we have is, especially with those overpotentials or those resistances in the system, we're going to hit those voltage limits a little sooner than we would with the equilibrium curve. So our capacity goes from this entire span all the way down to a smaller amount of measured capacity. So when we're looking at our equation to try to understand the measured capacity that's coming out of our system, we have to understand the actual equilibrium capacity. Did we lose lithium? Did we lose active material? And we have to subtract kinetic losses, so losses due to resistance in our system. Resistance is a little bit more complicated than just Ohm's law. There are a number of fundamental mechanisms that occur that will dictate the resistance for when diffusion in your electrode materials, charge transfer at the interface between your electrode materials and your electrolyte, and then additionally conduction through any sort of resistive layers. And all of these are going to contribute some sort of resistance. Now, these resistances are actually a function of lithiation state as well, adding to the complexity here. So we don't have a stagnant resistance throughout, we have a changing resistance throughout our voltage versus capacity profile. These mechanisms are pretty well understood, especially for a single particle. And so as a result, you might be able to say, okay, our measured capacity is going to be our actual equilibrium capacity minus kinetic losses, now modified as a function of the lithiation state. However, these single particle approximations are something that people generally make throughout the field, but end up not being an incredibly great assumption. So in our lab, what we've done is we've demonstrated that the interplay between the different particles actually manifests in different kinetic behavior. And so instead of just having one particle, like you might assume, we have tens of millions of particles actually within our electrode material, all with their own lithiation state, with their own resistance, and all interacting with one another. And this is something that's very overlooked in the field, and therefore is a major theme of my thesis work. I'm going to show you an example of how this consideration becomes important. It's a little bit more cartoons. So here I have a voltage versus capacity profile with our overpotentials and everything. What I'm showing here on the left-hand side is the resistance as a function of lithiation state. Now, when we start out, all of our particles in a totally discharged battery are likely going to start at the same lithiation state. That is what I'm showing over here. You can see a kind of a delta function in terms of the population density as a function of lithiation state, moving this way as we charge. What happens if we have a few particles that have incidentally better resistance? So lower resistance, better kinetics. What's going to happen is those particles, which I've outlined in blue in my little schematic here, are going to have a different resistance versus concentration of lithium profile throughout the course of cycling. This means for every single lithiation state, we're going to have a lower resistance. As a result, as we're charging, say I'm the current collector and I'm saying, okay, we're charging, give me an electron. I'm looking at the electrode, all the particles. I'm going to grab it from the fastest electrode particle, the one that's able to donate it most quickly. As a result, those ones are going to charge ahead of their counterparts in the battery. Again, we're not at equilibrium here. And because the resistance decreases as a function of lithiation state, they continue to get better and better. They continue to have lower and lower resistance, and you start to get a divergence of lithiation state as you charge. Now, eventually, the high driving force in moving away from the redox voltage of those uncharged particles is going to make your system approach more of a unimodal behavior in terms of population distribution among lithiation states, and you can get more unimodal behavior towards top of charge. Now, what happens on discharge? How is this different from the single particle approach? The reason is we're starting to see behavior that is not the same on charge and discharge. For example, as we discharge, what's going to happen is those better particles, sure, they're going to discharge ahead of those worse particles. But because the resistance is now increasing as a function of lithiation state, so we're now increasing capacity as we increase in lithiation state, now they're going to be more resistive than what were previously the more resistive particles. And so what you get is a more unimodal front as you discharge. The result being your resistance on discharge is limited by your worst particles. Your resistance on charge is facilitated by your best particles. So you get strong asymmetry in your charge-discharge behavior, and therefore a strong limitation on your discharge capacity. And so with this understanding in mind, I've approached traditional lithium-ion battery and electrolyte systems, and solid electrolyte systems by understanding not only the function of that kinetics is a function of lithiation state, but looking at the ensemble as a whole and how those interactions are going to have implications on your voltage and capacity profiles. And so this brings me to the outline of my talk, where I'm going to be discussing and going through the process that we very often do when we're learning material science. So we start with thermodynamics, what's happening at equilibrium. Then we modify that understanding with kinetics. So what are the ideal kinetics of the system? And then ideally we'll go one step further and try to understand the real system kinetics as a result. And so that's exactly the approach that I took when I'm trying to understand capacity in these systems. First, decoupling the equilibrium capacity, then understand the uniform lithiation state kinetic losses. So what happens if we treat it more like a single particle with one lithiation state? And then finally, what are the ensemble kinetic losses? When we have active cycling, we're not at equilibrium. What happens when all these things are interacting with one another? First, I will highlight and go through this type of equation in our liquid electrolyte system. These are the more traditional lithium-ion batteries, and talk about how a particular surface treatment is going to be interacting with heterogeneity, and do the same process again in terms of the solid electrolyte batteries. So let's begin with the liquid electrolyte batteries. I first want to go a little bit deeper and show you the crystal structure for our positive electrode material that I'm working with. This is a very common structure, lithium transition metal oxide. It's a layered structure where the lithium gets moved in and out of the lattice, so out as you charge, back in as you discharge. And the transition metals that I commonly use are nickel, manganese, and cobalt. Hence I will be calling this structure, this material, NMC for the remainder of this talk. This is just a positive electrode material. Now, very often when we synthesize this positive electrode material, there are some residual compounds that exist on the surface, so lithium hydroxide, lithium carbonate, among many others. And it is very common industrially to treat the surface after this synthesis in order to remove the lithium hydroxide and lithium carbonate. Now, this surface treatment that I unfortunately don't have the time to get into the nuts and bolts of during this talk, but what it's supposed to do is essentially just remove that surface layer. It's supposed to essentially remove the layer and remove the resistance associated with that layer. So the gain is supposed to be that we have reduced kinetic losses as a function of lithiation state. So just a surface treatment. Let's see what that does to the electrochemistry. Here I'm showing not a cartoon, but a real voltage versus capacity profile comparing untreated and treated batteries here. And the difference is quite small, so I'm zooming in on this discharge behavior, but that difference ends up being incredibly important when we zoom out to these long lifetime behavior or range type measurements that are implications for the EV price. And so if we're trying to understand this minute but reproducible difference in discharge behavior when we're going between the untreated and treated, let's take a look at the current understanding of how this surface treatment impacts our materials. So first, the current understanding is capacity in this case is improved due to a reduction in kinetic losses. By removing those lithium hydroxide, lithium carbonate surface layers, we're removing the resistive layer, just improving kinetics. Additionally, the surface treatment is only considered in how it uniformly improves the kinetics of the electrode particles. There is no consideration, as I said before, of the heterogeneity imparted and how that affects the electrochemistry, because it is not something that is often done, although sometimes done in the battery community. So in order to understand these or probe these current understandings, I wanted to do is actually what I said, start with the thermodynamics and then go into the kinetics. Let's make sure that we're not getting, perhaps improved equilibrium capacity. To measure this, I used a technique called potentiostatic intermittent titration technique, PITT for short. And essentially it's a series of voltage holds that we use to extract the equilibrium voltage curve behavior. If I compare the treated and untreated cases, what I'm actually seeing, if we look at the difference in charge and discharge capacity, is where the charge capacity is going to be the solid bar in back and the discharge capacity is the hashed lines in front. We're actually surprisingly seeing an improvement in charge capacity in the treated materials. Now, this is incredibly surprising because it's just supposed to be a surface treatment. It's not supposed to impact the volt. It's not supposed to add lithium anywhere. It's not supposed to affect your materials in any way. And so as a result, this is quite a unexpected finding, and now gives us an idea of the mechanism by which this surface treatment is improving our materials. So what does this mean for our kinetics? We should be able to recoup those improvements, because additionally, we're supposed to be improving kinetics, right? So if I compare the equilibrium, PITT, of the treated to the non-equilibrium regular cycling of the treated material, what we're seeing is we have some severe limitations on discharge. Now, maybe these severe limitations are not as bad as they are in the untreated material, but let's take a closer look. To do that, what I did is I made the lithiation state uniform via this PITT and coupled this with a technique that allows me to measure that resistance of that uniform lithiation state throughout this discharge area in particular, where we start to see some differences in behavior in the active cycling regime. So in order to probe those, I used a technique called electrochemical impedance spectroscopy, which I will not explain here, but I will say what it does is it allows you to piece apart the different mechanisms that are occurring at the interface to try to understand what is the most resistant process, what's leading to the resistance that we see. I then transform the data using something called distribution of relaxation times. What it does is allows you to associate a characteristic time constant with each one of these processes and look at the resistance as a function of those. And so as we're going through, let's start with some low voltage behavior and compare the treated to the untreated. And so on the y-axis here, I have what is going to be our analog for resistance. The x-axis is just the time constant, and so as we compare across similar time constants, what's surprising is at 3.3 volts, we see actually quite similar behavior in terms of resistance, similar order of magnitude between the two materials. This is a repeatable result. And then as we go further down, they become more similar, and they continue to be similar, and then at bottom of discharge, really low voltage, where we're supposed to have very different kinetics, but we have the same kinetics. And this is very surprising, because we thought that surface treatment is going to be removing resistance. Okay, well, now we have to take a second and think, we don't really know exactly what the surface treatment is doing now, because we've completely upended our understanding of how it's impacting the behavior of the materials. So let's go one step further and actually determine how heterogeneity is impacted as a result. To do that, I used a technique called operando X-ray diffraction. X-ray diffraction is something that makes use of the changing, this doesn't work, the changing crystal structure of our material. As you charge and discharge, what happens is your crystal structure grows and shrinks. What I'm showing here is as capacity increases, the top is going to be the measure of the C lattice, so basically the height of your crystal structure unit cell there, and you can see it starts to increase and then decrease at the end of discharge. Now it's a little bit difficult here to show you exactly what's happening in terms of the difference between the untreated and treated, because we want to have an understanding of heterogeneity. And so what we can do is look at the raw XRD pattern instead. What I'm showing here on the left is at the bottom of discharge, or right before you start to charge. And the important takeaways here is when we first start, remember, we should have a uniform lithiation state, single lithiation state. I do want to note that I'm using a lab scale XRD source here, so you have K alpha 1, K alpha 2 peaks, but this is representative of unimodal behavior of the 003 peak in NMC. As you charge, we're going to start to look for evidence of heterogeneity. That evidence will look like a wider distribution and a decreased intensity. And now, if we compare at some moderate capacity, we're actually starting to see that the treated material has a reduced intensity and a slightly broader distribution that's going to be representative of a broader distribution of lithiation states. This is starting to indicate exactly what I showed you before, that we have higher heterogeneity as a result of the surface treatment. As we continue charging, if we want to make sure we're seeing all the behavior we expect, it does become unimodal at the top of charge. And this is a result of us overcoming some of that high resistance due to the high driving force on the more resistant particles. And then finally, at top of charge, we start to see a splitting again, actually, as a result of some of those faster kinetically improved particles, again, because we're in a high resistance region. So we should see different behavior on discharge if this is really impacting our discharge behavior. So this is what I'm showing now, the discharge curve and the discharge C lattice going right to left this time. You can see at that same capacity that we had on charge, where we had very different behavior between the treated and untreated system, now both appear very unimodal on discharge. This trend continues all the way through discharge. Now, this is incredibly important because, again, we have this surface treatment that is known industrially to be removing a surface layer, should be improving the kinetics of our system. But what we're actually seeing is something quite surprising. One, we are improving the equilibrium capacity, which says a lot about the mechanism by which we are affecting our particles with the surface treatment. And then additionally, we're seeing is not necessarily an improvement in kinetics at all. What could be taken as something that will limit our kinetics, especially on discharge, because we have induced some heterogeneity in our system. So any gains that we start to see in our equilibrium capacity aren't going to be fully recouped on discharge. And this information is now helping us to understand how we can modify that surface treatment to optimize for that improved equilibrium capacity against some of this heterogeneity issue. So just to review what I talked about in this first section is by going through in what can be considered a kind of slow and methodical approach to understanding capacity, I've been able to overturn a few of our assumptions in the field. So first, we found that equilibrium capacity is actually higher in these surface treated materials. Additionally, the resistance is not decreased by the surface treatment as we might have previously thought, but surface treatment does lead to a heterogeneous ensemble, which has implications on our electrochemistry. So I want to continue with this kind of pattern and now apply it to the solid electrolyte field based on our ability to use this process to maybe perhaps, even though it's slow, more efficiently identify ways to optimize some of our surface treatments. And so that's exactly what I'll do. I will decouple the impact of heterogeneity in solid electrolyte batteries to understand the mechanism of capacity increase via surface coating. So let's start with some definitions here. First, I just want to go over some nomenclature, which can be a little bit annoying. So I'm talking about solid electrolyte batteries, liquid electrolyte batteries. Solid electrolyte batteries are more often known as solid state batteries, so SSBs, and liquid electrolyte batteries are more often known as LIBs, lithium ion batteries. It's confusing because solid state batteries are also lithium ion batteries, so that's rather unfortunate, but it is the way of the field and the way I will present it for the rest of this. So solid state batteries are exciting because they have some potential to have higher energy density. The reason is due to their differing microstructure. Let's take a look at what those interfaces look like in the solid state battery. So here I have the cartoon I had of the lithium ion battery before, where you have your particles connected by carbon black to your current collector, perfect contact with your liquid electrolyte as it's a liquid, it infiltrates your system. In a solid state battery system, you're swapping out that liquid electrolyte for solid electrolyte particles. Those solid electrolyte particles are not going to have that lovely perfect contacts that you have with the liquid electrolyte. Now you have more point contacts, solid-solid contacts. You have a real constriction of your lithium ion current between your NMC and your solid electrolyte, and that's going to be important for some of the implications later on. Here I have just a SEM micrograph of the same information, but now we see realistically the lighter particles are NMC, the darker particles are the solid electrolyte I use. This is an iridite, LPSCl, and then the carbon, which are actually these long strings of carbon atoms all together. And you can see that we have highly heterogeneous contacts here. Things are a little bit chaotic in terms of like the amount of contact a solid electrolyte particle or NMC particle has to one another. So what does that mean for our system in terms of these very heterogeneous contacts? Let's take a closer look at an even more detailed cartoon. Here what I'm showing is the current collector connected to the NMC via carbon, and again, the solid electrolyte. So solid state batteries, as I'm saying here, experience added complexity when we're trying to understand their capacity contributions. So first, in terms of equilibrium capacity, we have some more question marks here. First, you can think about solid electrolyte. In this case, the solid electrolyte has poor oxidative stability in the voltage range that we care about. This means that what you can do is at any electronic conductor interface, you can operate your solid electrolyte like an additional positive electric material. You can extract lithium and electrons from it. And this adds some question marks when you're trying to understand your charge discharge capacity and your solid state batteries. This can also happen at the NMC interface because that is also an electronic conductor. Additionally, as I mentioned in the last section of my talk, the NMC particles are going to change shape, change size as we are cycling in our battery. So what can happen is if you have particle contraction, for example, in some cases, because you have these point contact solids where it's not a liquid filling every void, you can experience more particle disconnection, in particular in solid state batteries. In terms of uniform lithium state kinetic losses, we now have to transport lithium across these reacted interfaces that have slightly higher resistance, as lithium is going to be a little bit more limited in terms of whether or not it can get through those. Additionally, the constriction from those solid-solid contacts is going to again lead to higher resistance when we're comparing to the lithium ion battery. And then finally, if we're considering the ensemble, we do have these highly heterogeneous contacts, so we are going to have an exacerbation of the issues in terms of differences across lithiation state. So let's take a look at how that actually impacts our capacity and voltage profile and try to piece through what's going on with the equilibrium and kinetic losses. So here I have a lithium ion battery profile, voltage versus capacity as I'm showing here. And this is just one example. Here I'm exhibiting only 5% capacity loss on my first cycle. If I compare that to a solid state battery that's offered under very similar conditions, same cathode and same positive electrode and everything, what I'm showing here is a 25% capacity loss with some key indicators. So first, I want you to take a look and see that we have an increased charge capacity. We also have this slight slantiness to the left-hand side of our plot, so it's like shoulder in our solid state battery data. And then on discharge, we're more severely limited. So these are all question marks, what's going on here. So the idea is that dominates the field and makes it really difficult to understand what's going on in terms of our losses in solid state batteries is that it is typical that we do not discharge below our electrolyte redox voltage. So when we charge, we're charging our solid electrolyte and then we charge our NMC. And as a result, on discharge, we actually don't go below the voltage at which you would discharge those oxidation products back to the original solid electrolyte. And so you will not get that capacity back no matter what, because you're not going below that voltage. So we don't know if the losses on discharge are only because we're not reversing the solid electrolyte redox, or is there some loss in NMC redox? The reason we can't figure this out is because current understanding in this field has the assumption that one, solid electrolyte redox, even if we went below that redox voltage, is not very reversible. Additionally, because we don't have that understanding, we have to make some assumptions. For example, that NMC particle disconnection plays a significant role in capacity loss. And then finally, some of the things that we do to improve our performance in the system, such as coating our NMC particles, to remove the oxidative instability at that interface, is that NMC coatings are improving capacity only by reducing the resistance from side reactions between your NMC and your solid electrolyte, and therefore removing that resistive layer through which lithium ions would have to conduct. If I want to go through again and just make sure all these assumptions are right, I'm going to do the same process as before. So I'll do a careful capacity accounting. But first, I'm going to start with solid electrolyte redox, really probe the reversibility of that solid electrolyte redox, see if we can learn anything there. And then I'll go through the NMC redox and try to categorize, okay, what's a reversible extent of NMC redox? Is there any particle disconnection as we theorize that's really contributing to some of our capacity loss? And what is our more kinetically irreversible, meaning capacity we can't get back under realistic operating conditions? All right, to begin with, let's look at the solid electrolyte redox. What I'm showing here is the first cycle charging profile of our solid state battery. And I do want to zoom in here. As I said before, we have this little slanty region, which I'm going to call a shoulder. That shoulder is known to be indicative of solid electrolyte oxidation. That solid electrolyte oxidation, although this does not account for all of the solid electrolyte oxidation, tends to correlate with solid electrolyte oxidation. So we have operando XRD as well that confirms this correlation between the two. Additionally, on what we see on second charge is no shoulder. This is because we do not reduce the solid electrolyte back to its original form, so we cannot oxidize it on the second cycle. So we haven't discharged the solid electrolyte, we can't recharge it on the second cycle. So we lose this kind of electrochemical signature associated with solid electrolyte oxidation. So that begs the question, what happens if we do try to discharge the solid electrolyte? And so here I'm comparing if we discharge only to above the electrolyte redox voltage, we have 25% capacity loss. And indeed, if we go below that electrolyte redox voltage, as we expected, we get some capacity back. We get now 10% capacity loss rather than 25% capacity loss. And we don't know how much of that capacity regain comes from solid electrolyte redox or NMC redox. So can we confirm that we're doing some amount of solid electrolyte redox here? One way we tried to do this was using X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy, which is what I'm showing here. What it does is it probes the chemical environment at the surface of your species. And I'm comparing for sulfur, which is one of the main components of our solid electrolyte, between the 2.5 and 2 volt case. And I do just want to call attention to 2 areas. So first up here, the SOX peak. What I'm showing here is that we do have evidence of it in 2.5, but no evidence of it in the 2 volts. And this to me is indicating that we are reducing some of those species that came about through oxidation while we were charging. And then additionally, we see an increase in the relative magnitude of the PS4 subunit, which is one of the main components of our original solid electrolyte. Again, indicating that we are getting a bit more reduction of our solid electrolyte, which could be closer to its original form. Okay, these are more active cycling, however, which is not equilibrium capacity as I promised you. So what I did instead was I took this and I increased the temperature up to 45 degrees Celsius, and I waited a heck of a lot longer than I did here in terms of our voltage hold. So how do we get over those kinetics, those resistances? We wait longer, we add more thermal energy, and we try to extract equilibrium capacity. Let me break down the experiment for you here, another cartoon. So here I'm showing as we charge on the first cycle, we get that little shoulder, that slanty region, that dip. On discharge, I am going to discharge below the electrolyte redox voltage. Typically, if I don't go below that redox voltage, I will not get a shoulder back on the second cycle. I will have limited charge capacity on the second cycle. So the hypothesis is the longer I hold, the more solid electrolyte reduction I'm getting, the more oxidation I can get on the next cycle. So first question, can I recover that second cycle shoulder by doing this reduction via the voltage hold? And so what I'm showing here, zoomed way into the shoulder region, as I increase the length of the voltage hold from a half hour all the way to 66 hours, a long time, I can indeed recover that same signature that tends to be indicative of solid electrolyte oxidation now on the second cycle, where we weren't getting that previously. Okay, great, looks like we are able to get something that's similar to the solid electrolyte oxidation, but can we get the other signature, which is regained capacity? If we are indeed reversing solid electrolyte redox, we should get a correlation between the two. That's what I'm showing here. On the x-axis is the measure of solid electrolyte redox capacity via that shoulder. On the y-axis, it's going to be the charge capacity of the second cycle divided by that of the first cycle. And turns out it looks like we are getting pretty close to 100% in terms of regaining our first cycle charge capacity. Now, this is really surprising and exciting for 2 reasons. First, it was largely assumed in the field that the solid electrolyte redox is not reversible. But here we're showing if you wait long enough and you increase the temperature, you can indeed reverse some of those reactions. Additionally, it is really exciting because we have maximally 2% loss on our second cycle. And that 2% loss could only be the amount that we could be accounting for in terms of NMC particle disconnection, because this accounts for both solid electrolyte redox and NMC redox. So before, when we thought NMC particle disconnection could be accounting for a major significant portion of that 25% loss, instead it could maximally account for 2%. So these are overturning at least 2 of our large assumptions in the field in terms of how we're thinking we're losing capacity on the first cycle. So what are the implications for active cycling? How does NMC redox, the kinetic reversibility of NMC redox, how is it impacted in more realistic conditions? So for example, at room temperature, 30 degrees Celsius instead of 45 degrees Celsius. The important thing to consider here, I'll show with another cartoon, as we increase the resistance by decreasing the temperature, so as we increase the resistance in our system, what happens is we're hitting those voltage limits sooner and sooner, as we said before. And in this case, we might hit that voltage limit in a realistic condition before we've completed NMC redox. So on discharge, you generally have serial NMC redox, then solid electrolyte redox. If we do start to have some limitations of NMC redox, this plot in the upper left will look a little bit different. It will look like a sloping up line at first, which is going to be more indicative of us increasing in second cycle capacity without increasing in solid electrolyte redox before it starts to level out and match what's happening at 45 degrees Celsius. And luckily for me, that's exactly what we measured. So you start to get a sharper slope at the start and then it levels out. So it starts to indicate to us that, okay, indeed on discharge, some of our limitations, some of that maybe 25% capacity loss on discharge is going to be coming from some of our NMC redox not being fully reversed. We also have some companion operando XRD data for it, where what I'm showing on the x-axis is the duration of the voltage hold on discharge. A little bit confusing, but as you increase in time in the voltage hold, and then on the y-axis, I have the lithiation state, which comes from the fit parameters of our operando XRD. And you expect the lithiation state to increase as you further and further discharge. Comparing a solid state battery to a lithium-ion battery, we start to get very similar behavior between the two, which to me indicates throughout this voltage hold, we're getting majority NMC redox, especially at the start, which is what we're showing here. Okay, so now we have a good understanding that NMC redox is going to be one of our limiting factors in the realistic situation. How does heterogeneity come into play? The coup de grace of everything. So to measure that, we have more operand of XRD. What I'm showing here is during charging, we have clear evidence of heterogeneity as we charge or delithiate, going from right to left in 003 peak here. What I'm showing is a clear splitting of lithiation state population density, which is our indicator of heterogeneity on charge, which we do not see on discharge. To understand how this impacts our kinetics, and this is work that I've done with my mentee, Xiaomian Yang, who I'm very proud of. What was done was a technique called biased electrochemical impedance spectroscopy. Again, we'll get into details now, happy to chat later. But what we're able to do is extract the charge transfer resistance as a function of lithiation state. You can see on charge, we have a map of the lithiation state, and on discharge, as a result of this asymmetric behavior, we now have a higher discharge charge transfer resistance for every single lithiation state. So this asymmetric behavior is very important because it's one of the things that limits our discharge capacity in a way that is not often considered in the battery field. So what happens when we apply our coatings that are supposed to do nothing but improve our kinetics in terms of lower charge transfer uniformly throughout? So what I'm comparing here is the electrochemistry from bare NMC. So bare means uncoated, untreated, nothing, NMC, to our coated materials. And that's exactly what we're seeing is an improvement in coulombic efficiency, so the amount of capacity that we're getting back on our first cycle. So what does that look like in terms of the charge transfer resistance? And when we coat this material, it is supposed to reduce that resistance and improve kinetics throughout. So first thing that we notice is we are able to create a coated material that actually has a slightly higher charge transfer resistance throughout the duration of charging. So this is quite unexpected considering we're getting better behavior here. But let's take a look at what happens on discharge. On discharge throughout, the coated material actually outperforms the bare NMC. And this is really exciting because it's only in this situation where you're considering heterogeneity do you get this type of implication, you get this impact on recycling behavior, despite there being a net higher charge transfer resistance as a function of lithiation state just because of the coating. And so this is a really important finding because now instead of just searching for coating materials that are going to improve oxidative stability at that interface, now we have to consider how we are impacting metrics like heterogeneity when we are designing coating materials. So in summary, what I've done is, again, by going through this slow methodical stepping through each of these capacity loss mechanisms, I've been able to show that instead of what we thought before, solid electrolyte oxidation is highly reversible if we wait long enough. And particle disconnection is actually not a main capacity loss mechanism as was previously thought. And then finally, NMC coatings actually reduce the impact of heterogeneity on some of our capacity loss mechanisms, which is one of the more exciting ones. Not only have I, for these two areas, been able to show you some of the assumptions that we've overturned in the field, but I've been able to, with this process, identify optimization metrics that are going to span material systems and treatments, which I think is pretty powerful, especially in the traditional lithium-ion battery liquid electrolyte field. Now what we have and can work with are better informed surface treatment protocols that are improving charge capacity, allow us to eke out that last little bit of capacity because we can optimize against heterogeneity. Additionally, now we have more mechanism-driven materials discovery being enabled by our understanding of how that coating is impacting heterogeneity in our system. I think last thing is these are the publications associated with this work, with the three highlighted being the ones that I talked about today. Yeah, thank you.
I know we have time for a few questions.
Awesome defense talk. I just had a quick question about the recovery of the shoulder upon second cycle, like as you waited, like you held the voltage at the lower end like for longer periods of time.
Mhm.
When you held it at 66 hours, did that shoulder replicate the first cycle, like in terms of its size, or I think it was 98 or what was the percentage?
Yeah, they
comparison?
were very similar in terms of net actual capacity associated with one another. The shape was a little different, but that has a lot to do with the mixed voltage interaction between the NMC particles and the solid electrolyte redox happening, because we don't return to the same exact lithiation state distribution among particles.
Is that why you never went higher in time?
I did go higher in time, and you don't get any more capacity.
Okay, cool. So that's, yeah, that makes sense.
Mhm.
Thanks.
Following up on that, what stops you from going to lower and lower voltages to try to recover the shoulder faster?
Now, there's a number of things. One is protecting the NMC. You are actually at risk of over-lithiating and causing irreversible reactions. And then additionally, solid electrolyte, not only can it oxidize, but the neutral solid electrolyte, even before you oxidize, it can be reduced as well. And so you don't want to go below that reduction potential. Yeah.
Wonderful defense. Thank you so much for explaining everything so clearly. You might have mentioned this, but I missed it. What would particle disconnection look like in this data if that was showing up? And do you see any signs of?
Right. So particle disconnection looks like you are completely losing some of your capacity. And so it would look like you cannot fully recover all of your charge capacity on that second cycle. And so because we're getting to 98%, that shows that we can recover all of our solid electrolyte capacity and our NMC capacity. Thank you. Yeah.
It's a very interesting talk. I wanted to ask about the first part where you were looking at an ensemble particle size distribution. So here you're looking at predominantly NMC, but in LFP you find kind of a very big hysteresis effect, very different behavior on charge and discharge, even if you're doing very slow cycling. Do you think that kind of that multi-particle size is affecting that kind of hysteresis in LFP as well, or is that more kind of on a charge versus more kind of not an equilibrium effect?
Yeah, so the LFP case is interesting just because it's a phase change material, and then you have to consider the strain across the interface between the two phases. And so I think that's been what's largely attributed to the hysteresis between charge and discharge, even at slow currents.
Mm.
But I mean, it will play an effect. It will affect things. So one thing that I always kind of yell from the rooftops is like, even in a phase change material, the width of your plateau, no matter how slow you're going, is still going to be impacted by the fact that you have multiple particles in your system. So the mixed voltage of that system is going to really impact the plateau width. So you might have more capacity you could have extracted from that plateau, but you might have some particles charging ahead because you're not exactly at equilibrium. Great question.
Explains all the young.
I think a theme that I'm seeing here in general is the role of the ensemble. And as you mentioned, this is something that the field has not considered a ton. And so I'm wondering if you can say something about like how you landed on identifying that as such a crucial factor, and maybe also like where else you could see that playing a role, the role of the particle ensemble beyond LFP, beyond this work.
Oh yeah. So I mean, that comes out of some of the previous work in our group, yes. So is really demonstrating how for example, if we look at operando XRD, that's where we first discovered it as a group, as you know. In terms of like really showing the distribution of lithiation state, and that comes a lot into some of our more careful measurement, especially of discharge behavior. So it's really difficult to get back to full lithiation state because the resistance becomes so high. But some of the behavior that we're showing comes at the field-wide argument between whether charge transfer diffusion is one of the most limiting factors in the battery materials. Anyway, that's where it came from. That's where this started. Comes a lot from my mentorship as well. But this has implications, for example, in like especially in particle size. I think particle size is one of the most important things that we don't often consider. Has implications for your work too, Grace, as you know. Which let's watch Grace's defense next week too. Okay.
One final question.
One final question. Bring on. Yeah, go ahead.
So for the heterogeneity that's introduced by that treatment, do you think that that's, you were showing the image of the secondary particle, right?
Yeah.
Like, so do you think it's taking off the coating just from the secondary and like maybe not so much from the parts?
For the
ones
liquid
inside?
electrolyte?
Yeah,
Yeah, so I didn't have time to get into the mechanism, but there is some evidence that shows that the surface treatment that removes lithium hydroxide, lithium carbonate, can also actuate grains and therefore dislodge grains, change, and that in effect can impact particle size distribution in its own right.
interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. I do want to go ahead with my
To
acknowledgements.
you, Emma.
So first our professional acknowledgements. So I do want to thank my committee first and foremost. So for joining the committee, you know, I've had the pleasure of working alongside some of the co-advised students between the two groups and your group throughout the years. I'm really excited to get your expertise on a lot of this work. To Johanna, who we're talking today, was briefly a postdoc in this group actually at one point, but I think has a really exceptionally aligned background with a lot of the work that I've done, so also excited to get your input. To Alberto, who is our department chair, I think taught one of the best thermodynamics courses I've ever taken. I've taken many because I love thermo, and who has supported me in my teaching. We've worked a lot together on department programs. And has supported my career hereafter. I'm so grateful for everything you've done and I'm really excited to chat about the thermo here. And then finally to Chris, who is the chair of my committee. You may not recall necessarily my project, but I did take your electrochemical methods course in my second year. And it was a rude awakening to my lack of understanding of electrochemistry. So I really hope that, not say you're rude, just but I hope you can be proud of the progress I've made largely as a result of having taken that course. I do also want to thank many people I've collaborated with who are all listed here. I do want to highlight a few. So Dr. Zhong Jiang, Emma Choi, Nidhi Kapate, all contributed work that you saw today. My undergraduate mentee, Xiang Mian, she is just incredibly exceptional. I am honored that I had the opportunity to work with her for 4 years. And much of the last portion of the talk is her work that she is focused on in terms of genetics and coding. So I'm immensely proud of her. She's going to go and do great things. Just keep an eye on her. And then finally to Professor Stephen Kong, who was at that time a staff scientist in our group. He was an incredible mentor for me in really difficult times and really helped me through a majority of this project. So I'm incredibly indebted to him as well. Thank you to our industrial affiliates at Samsung and the ASF, to my funding sources, NSF-GRP, Stanford Graduate Fellowship, Gerald J. Lieberman Fellowship last year, DOE, VTO, and Samsung for funding me or my research. And then finally to the Chu group, both the alums and the current members. You really made this experience in the Chu group really memorable, and I have some more personal acknowledgements thereafter. But finally, I do want to thank Will, of course. Will, you have many titles. Associate Professor of Material Science and Engineering, of Energy Science and Engineering, of Photon Science. You're a senior fellow at Precourt. You have the Battery Center now. You are co-founder of Mitra Chem. None of these matter to me. But here are some that do.
Not if you want to pass.
Incredibly insightful and creative scientist, pillar of thorough and honest research, an outstanding research mentor, and the reason I am the capable scientist I've grown to be. Okay. Truly though, Will, you really helped me through a lot of really hard times. I'm not the easiest student. And you really were very steadfast and helped me through a lot of difficulties. And I'm so indebted to you for what you've already done and what I'm sure you'll do for the rest of my career. So thank you so much. Okay, now for more fun things. I have a different slideshow because there were so many pictures.
Respects, yeah.
Okay. All right. Very good. Okay. So here are some more fun things that we've done as a group. I want to thank the two group as a whole for the incredible mentorship that I've received throughout these years and the incredible number of friends that I've gained throughout being in this group. We are a giant group, as you can see in some of these giant group pictures, but it's never felt giant to me because I've been able to know each and every one of you very personally. And it's really been an honor to get to know you and to be able to work with you. And I'm incredibly grateful for everything you've done for me in these past 6 years. I do want to make a special shout out to my cohort in the Chew group. We are a very large cohort. There's some not so nice pictures. These are all from our first group retreat in 2019. I really want to thank my cohort for in the Chew group for really supporting me and putting up with so much nonsense throughout my PhD. You guys are friends for life, honestly. Among the many other friends that I have at Stanford, who have all made this just an absolute blast, and have additionally helped me through some difficult times that were a function of being in the PhD. It's been just so good to meet you all and now have you as a part of my life. I do also want to thank, this is my class, so when I was able to teach Math Sci 144, I want to thank the students for, allowing a grad student to teach their thermo course. It was really such a special class, and I had such a wonderful time teaching them. And thank you to my TAs, especially Sophia and Eder, who put up with a lot of my anxiety. Then I also want to thank my Northeastern University friends, who are just such a special group of people who have, even though I've been here on the West Coast, have always gone the extra mile to make me feel like I'm still included and part of the family, no matter where they've been, no matter where I've been. It's really, I couldn't be here today without their support, help, and very good times. So beautiful. Okay, and then I do want to thank Justin's family in particular. Justin's my partner, and his family is here on the West Coast with me. They really treated me like one of their own, bringing me food, making sure I'm okay, inviting me to everything, really welcoming me into their family. And so I've had just a really special time and really supportive time here as a result. And then of course I want to thank Justin, who I'm gonna cry, but sorry, but he's really, I really wouldn't have graduated if it wasn't for Justin supporting me and making me food and cleaning for me. He's really supported me throughout my PhD, and he is also earning a PhD through this process. And then finally to my family, it's been really hard being away from you, but it's been, there's never a day that you made me feel bad about being here or anything. All of you are such incredible role models in terms of being so empathically minded, working hard in areas that didn't necessarily were your first try, being incredible mentors in your own field. And I really hope that, I can live up to that kind of precedent that you set. Thank you so much.